Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In this episode, we're talking Russian C2 and reflexive control with Ivana Stradner. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic, we make the coordination of fires simple by unifying your operational and fires missions plans into one C4 ISR management platform. The Sit-Aware Fire Support module increases your responsiveness by reducing the time between target identification and fire's response, while ensuring full collaboration between all elements involved in the operation.
Many of the discussions in episodes we've done over the past couple of years have been built around the C2 concept through a distinctly Western lens. And here, I get that you will not like the Western descriptor, but bear with me. I'm talking about the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, South Korea, et al., the liberal democracies, if you will, those with a broadly similar take on command and control, at least from a military lens. Yet one of the things I'm always fascinated by is how others conceive of C2. You might recall that we've already talked a bit in previous episodes about the Ukrainian model, how the Israelis are different, and a few other non-Western models. And I'd like to get, over the course of the next couple of years, into that a little bit more. Whether neutral parties, belligerents or adversaries, understanding that others don't think the same way about an issue like C2 is important. C2 is one of those things that everyone in the West seems to think the whole world has a homogenous view about, and that's just wrong. I mean, it's hard to find a senior serving officer in uniform across NATO who thinks that mission command is not a prerequisite to success in every circumstance, or that Western military commanders can't teach others a thing or two about how they do control. Yet those same people also seem to believe that the Russians, for example, or the Iranians operate in a dictatorial manner across the command chains. The reality on the ground is probably more interesting. There's significant evidence that both the IRGC and elements of the Russian military provide their junior officers with considerably more latitude and freedoms than Western counterparts do. As one joker expressed to me last week, others talk less about mission command and delegation, but are much better at executing it than traditional Western militaries. It's a kind of strange reversal of positions from the Cold War when you've got the IRGC or the Houthis who are decentralising military operations beyond the fashionable, while Western militaries are busy centralising C2 functions as quickly as possible to make their mantra of multi-domain operations work. Russia is also pushing hard to operationalise artificial intelligence into C2 in the field. A new system called SVOD is starting to be used by Russian army units in February 2026, with similar aims to those that NATO states are all talking about. Better and closer control of units, more synchronised actions, more effective use of fires, and detailed course of action recommendations to commanders on the ground down to sub-unit levels. So I thought it worthwhile talking to someone who understands some of the ideas behind Russian C2 to contrast what we think we know with some evidence and research. Dr. Ivana Stradner serves as a research fellow at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. She studies Russia's security strategies and military doctrines to understand how Russia uses information operations for strategic communication. Her work examines both the psychological and technical aspects of Russian information security. Ivana also serves as a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post. Before joining FDD, Ivana was the Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and she works as a visiting scholar at Harvard and a lecturer with a variety of universities, including universities of California, Berkeley School of Law. Ivana, listen, welcome to the show. You and I both want to reprise our conversation we had late last year about reflexive control during this episode. But first, let's start with some baseline knowledge about Russian C2. Tell me about Russian command and control, political through tactical. Are there some foundational things that it's based on? How does it relate from the history and what we believe to what we actually see today?
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I absolutely agree with you that there are so many talks nowadays on how to counter Russian propaganda. But to do so, we really need to understand what is the source of it. How is Russian military structure, and not only military, but also intelligence? Because as you correctly noted, If we want to counter our adversaries in the information space, we have to understand that they do not think like us. They do not process information like us. So that's precisely why I'm very passionate about this subject, because Russian C2 works very differently from the way that, for example, NATO or the US C2 operates. It's very fragmented and it's nonlinear. And it's, for example, in the West, including in NATO, we consider cyber as part of a military domain, for example. But Russian model actually perceives that in a more holistic way as a cover, let's say, political warfare infrastructure. And some of your listeners may wonder why I bother you today to talk about cyber when the purpose of our conversation is information warfare. Well, the reason why I'm doing that, it's not because I just want to be a boring academic, bother you with theories, but we cannot think deeply before we think clearly. And I want to make one thing crystal clear: how Russia understands information warfare. In Russian doctrine, they do not even use the word cyber. They only use the word cyber when they refer to Western cyber operations, let's say attacks on critical infrastructures, et cetera, et cetera. They use the term information security. And if some of your listeners are working in this field, they may wonder, why am I bothering you with such semantics, tiny things? The reason is because, unlike the Western understanding of cybersecurity, Russia combines the technical part with its psychological part. So, for example, they combine the technical part, let's say attacks on critical infrastructure, with a cognitive part, which is what we call in the West psychological operations or information operations. That really matters a lot. Why? Because when we are talking about the structure of Russia's C2, we have to understand that it's absolutely fragmented and that information security can fall within FSB, GRU, SVR. But not only that, it's very important to understand how Russian so-called civil society plays a very important role into shaping the information space. We have to understand also how Russia has been using cyber criminal gangs and ransomware, like different groups, to basically use plausible deniability, which is very important to understand why it's extremely difficult to counter Russian C2. We have to also understand that, for example, in the US, it's not that we have, like, let's say, Cyber Command. A Russian C2 operates. I don't want to dive into all those tiny details like a military to understand like how each group operates. But for example, how Russian intelligence service has its own different cyber units, how they're actually coordinate within the Russian government, and how they're actually approved at a very high level. So it's very important to understand that when we are talking about Russia's military understanding on information security, we cannot divorce this from psychological operations, because the whole purpose of Russian information security, or as we like to call it, cybersecurity, it's not only to attack critical infrastructure, but rather, for example, to destabilize society, to destroy trust, to create confusion, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to give a very concrete example. Actually, maybe that's one of my favorite examples. So more than a decade ago, when Russia decided to go after Ukraine back in 2014, there was a huge cyber attack in France on the French TV Monde 5. So apparently, when there was that attack, allegedly, ISIS took responsibility. After a while, the French government exposed Russia's intelligence being behind that, and basically that there was a Russian fancy bear, if I'm not mistaken, behind this whole attack. And now, why does that matter? Think about this. When Russia wanted to attack Ukraine and they went after Ukraine in 2014, and the first step towards Russia's subjugation of Ukraine, They understood very well that the last thing that Putin wanted back then was the Western support. And back then, everything was around the war and terror. So Putin understood very well by targeting key media in France and by portraying that as a basically terrorist taking over in terms of responsibility, that would linger in the minds of many people in France why they should not support the French government supporting Ukraine out of fear of escalation, et cetera, et cetera. Which brings me, to the next point. Russia is, in my view, one of the most powerful influence operations on nuclear weapons. But to go back to strategic reasoning behind Russian information security C2, Russia understands very well that the Kremlin cannot compete and win against NATO using hard power. They understand very well that they can win this war using asymmetric methods, using plausible deniability. And after all, this is very cheap for them. And because it gives them a massive reach towards a global community, we do not have very clear lines, because even if you look at the NATO's statements on cybersecurity or information warfare, they keep saying, is it Article 5 or not? We still don't know. What is hybrid war? What is not? So NATO itself is quite, if I may say, confused about how NATO operates below the threshold of war. But Russia is not confused, because if you go back to Russia's history and read more about their intelligence apparatus, that's how they're operating. The concept of deception, for all your listeners who love to read literature, I highly recommend, when people ask me what they should read to understand Russian cybersecurity, there are a bunch of, reports and doctrines, etc., you can find in Russian military journals. But the best thing to do is actually to read Russian literature, because that helps you really understand how deception works. So basically, the whole point is to organize confrontation just below the threshold of war. And that's why cybersecurity and information security is perfect for that.
So there's lots there to unpack. I just want to come back right at the start. You said, well, it's fragmented and non-linear. And as you went through the explanation, I sort of got that. So you got a whole bunch of criminal networks, information security, cyber people, you've got security services, you've got the military, you've got foreign affairs, economic and diplomatic levers. And all of those seem to be tugging at the same thing. There's this sort of conventional line of thinking that says all these actions are very centrally controlled, orchestrated, if you will, through the Kremlin, through Putin himself, as if he has some sort of grand schematic campaign plan with everything synchronized out and put through. It doesn't feel like that's actually the way the Kremlin works. I get that Putin and people at the top will give broad direction, but is there more than that? Do they authorize individual attacks? Do they have to approve actions for this fragmented community of actors that sit below them? Or is there just sort of broad guidance given out?
I think, when we are talking about Russia's system matters, and they love to think about the world as a system. So I always, laugh when I read the Russian analysts talking about the United States, because they believe that there is a system here. So no matter what President Trump says, there is always that linear way of thinking that it is going against Russia. So even if President Trump says something nice about Russia, they do not trust such statements. And I'm not surprised, because that really represents perfectly how the Russian government operates. So here is the thing. I doubt that Putin wakes up and then suddenly he decides to call a random hacktivist group and to say, hey, let's spread propaganda about Greenland. Let's spread propaganda about the creation of a multipolar world, like filling the blank. So I doubt that something like that operates. But on top, you have a very clear messaging that is happening, and that is basically then going down the chain how to conduct all those operations. And at the very bottom, it's really interesting to observe all those not only hacktivist groups, but also when it comes to information operations groups on Telegram, how they're actually appearing as a grassroots movements, but actually in the end of the day, if you can connect the dots, they're not. But the most important thing is we have to understand that they operate as a linear system. However, when it comes to the operational side of pushing for those messaging, it's actually very fragmented at the very bottom. And that's precisely why it's extremely difficult to target it, especially when it comes to how they're training information operations forces, how they're positioning their information operations forces, how they're adapting their information operations structures. Because a lot of analysts in the West, when they're talking about Russian influence operations, they're still stuck in 2016 and Russian influence operations around the US elections. And it's, Peter, quite really odd that I'm the busiest around the election times, whether it's in Moldova, whether it's in the United States. So I can guarantee you, I hope if we have to have another podcast, please don't call me before the midterms in the US, because everyone will be talking about the elections interference there. But here is the problem. Russia doesn't operate around the elections times only. It's 365 days, 24/7 around any issue. Filling the blank, whether today it's the question of Iran, whether it's the question of deep state, whether it's the question of LGBTQ groups, anything that is currently in the news, I can guarantee you nowadays there is a snowstorm in Washington, D.C. One of the most intriguing influence operations that has been around for decades is how allegedly the CIA control the weather. So every time when there is a massive heat or cold, there is that whole thing that we have a special system here to control the weather. So if someone from the CIA is listening to this conversation, please fix the weather first in the US before you go out there, according to the Russians. But anyway, on a serious note, that's something that we have to understand how they have adapted their influence operations after the Cold War. And we cannot be stuck in 2016 talking only about the election times. And we have to also understand how they're combining both the technical and the psychological part.
So that draws out quite interesting. So there's part of me that wants to talk about the long-term nature of this. I was talking to someone the other day and pointing out President Putin came to power after Boris Yeltsin. He's been around a long time, right? So there doesn't have to be a long-term strategy. The formations, the groups under him tend to have been with him long enough that they recognize his overall objectives and can go out and make things happen without detailed direction. But you wrote a couple of years ago something very interesting about this looking like an updated set of active measures, something that Putin very much grew up around. I think you wrote this in 2023, maybe before. But this idea that this was just simply active measures updated for a contemporary world. It also struck me while reading that piece from you that the way Russia executes its campaigns now and how it commands and runs them is very similar to the way that the British executed operations during the Cold War. Right, so the aim of destabilizing former Soviet powers in Eastern Europe, all these tools are straight out of a British intelligence service playbook. There's something we should be intimately familiar with because we used it a lot, right? Do you think this is just an update of their old active measures, something Putin would be very familiar with from his own experience in the KGB? Or is this something about they learned more from the West?
So, Peter, I'm glad that you brought this question now because first of all, for your listeners who are coming from the UK, people love to talk about Russia fearing the United States, but there is, in my view, the only country in the West that Putin is truly, truly afraid of, it's the UK. And there are many reasons, for that, because first of all, for Russia, this is not a Cold War 2.0. For Russia, this is the Great Game 2.0. And we can have a separate conversation on why, Putin is constantly going after the UK and why it's, in my view, very, very important to follow when it comes to how London perfectly understands the Kremlin's way of thinking, reasoning, why they're not falling for Russia's nuclear threats, how they can manipulate emotions within Putin. Even Lavrov was very emotional a few days ago when he said basically that Great Britain is not great anymore. We should just call it Britain. So all those type of emotional reactions is something that London really knows how to exploit. But going back, I don't believe that Putin adopted this playbook from the UK. This is a very old playbook. And I'll start with as soon as Putin came to power, what happened, and then I'll do backward induction. As soon as Putin came to power, there was already in space a new information security doctrine. And if you read carefully that doctrine, in one of the first few paragraphs, it openly states that Russia has to preserve its traditional moral and spiritual values. And I know a lot of people in the West are going to roll their eyes and to tell me, why are you talking about this nonsense during a serious conversation with Peter? I'll tell you why, because this is the cornerstone of why Russia has developed offensive information capabilities after 2000. Because as soon as Putin came to power, and he already openly stated that one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he firmly believes that that happened because of powerful information operations. And I have to admit, he's not wrong. Why? Because the United States was the superpower when it comes to influence operations. Ronald Reagan unapologetically targeted Russian audience with American jazz music and American modern art and American values and democracy. So if you ever meet people from behind the Iron Curtain, and if they tell you why we love American modern art, and my American friends are always appalled that I love the decadent American art, it is precisely because of American influence operations. But going back on a serious note, yes, we were spreading, back during the Cold War, Washington was spreading very powerful messages around democracy, around freedom, using different tools to win hearts and minds. And Putin knows this. Putin remembers. But here is a caveat. Nowadays, with all due respect, American jazz music, American modern art are not going to help, because Putin made sure domestically to completely shut down the information system and to completely control it domestically. At the same time, and I'm more than happy to dive deeper into this topic and to explain in detail how Putin became paranoid after 2012 and massive protests that were, according to him, basically coordinated on social media, but also messaging such as WhatsApp. And no wonder why he established Roskomnadzor as a watchdog, media watchdog, to go after all those media. So I'm more than happy to dive deeper into that. But I want to answer your question, where this came from. We have to understand that the whole concept of Russian information warfare, like many people in the West who believes that this is some Gerasimov doctrine, it's not, because it's not even a doctrine. This is an old concept that was established more than 100 years ago, but I don't want to dive deeper into that. What I want to emphasize is something after the end of the World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union established a special unit on cybernetics. So for all fans of game theory, I think this is a fun fact. So Washington hired numerous mathematicians to do Cold War projections on nuclear escalations, and they were doing mathematical modeling around potential nuclear attacks. And there are so many fancy, game theories who have established those games. At the same time, the Kremlin said, well, we also probably have to have something similar. So they established a special unit on cybernetics, and they hired a really brilliant guy, Lefebvre, who had a fascinating background in physics, mathematics, and psychology. So unlike American game theory models that were very linear, Russia established a very broad game theory models that basically they would do modeling of your decision-making process, of Russia's decision-making process, and then the final unit of the two. So it's a very, very holistic game theory. And it's fascinating because the whole point of reflexive control, which is the concept that this guy has been working on, it means that you have to feed your opponent with certain information that he or she believes that would benefit him or her, but actually would benefit you. So how to basically find that reflex and how to use that against your enemy. So it's all about how to overload your cognition, how to exploit different biases, how to manipulate expectations. So if I can think of a perfect KGB strategy on deception, that would be reflexive control. And once again, I apologize to your audience for being just a boring academic bringing this, but I have to, because even nowadays, if you look at how the Russian military intelligence is operating in this field, they still reflexively control the West. So we are not even aware that we are actually detrimental to our own failure. We are falling for their manipulation constantly. They're literally like, I feel like a cat who is putting a laser out there, and we are like cats chasing, that laser. So that's something that we have to be very mindful and to understand that that's also part of why it's extremely difficult to counter Russian C2, because we have to basically counter our own narratives. And it's very different how NATO's C2 is operating, because in Russian doctrine, the whole point is to control your audience and basically how to model the adversary decision-making process, and then to identify some reflex points, how to, for example, do like all those predictable reactions, and finally to apply and to inject those information signals, and then let the adversary act and to basically reflexively control itself. And then the best part is what you have to do if you are coming from the Kremlin. Take a really nice and big bag of popcorns and watch, and then adjust. And that's a cycle that is going like this. So I'm not, as you know, someone who loves to admire problems. I love to solve them. So I would also like to, if you allow me, to have a few seconds explaining what can we do about that.
Go for it.
So, number one thing is we have to understand that Russia's command and control works very differently from Western command and control. And with all due respect, the world doesn't revolve around Brussels, London, or Washington, D.C. And that's number one thing. Second thing, what we have to do is basically to understand how Russia injects those reflexive points. What are our own vulnerabilities in our society and how they're very, very fragmented? And number one thing that we have to do is not only to develop all those defensive capabilities, such as writing long reports, which I doubt that even my family is reading anymore. I think it's really past time to go on the offensive and to apply our own concept of reflexive control to reflexively control Russia. Because we love to think sometimes about put him on a pedestal that Russia is big, tall, but we are not. And to remind your audience, Putin was a second-rate KGB agent. Some people might argue even third-rate KGB agent, which means that he is not that super powerful when it comes to influence operations. So number one thing is we have to understand that reflexive control depends on knowing how you will react. And as Russia has been exploiting our vulnerabilities, Putin also has its own vulnerabilities that we can exploit. Number one thing is we cannot and we should not constantly react to their influence operations, talking what is right, what is not right, this is Russian disinformation, etc., etc. That actually helps them. That's also part of a reflexive control. The best part would be to pre-frame it, to start teaching Western audience that information is a weapon. And this is just as another weapon as javelins, as like any missiles that is unfortunately stealth, which means you cannot see, you cannot touch, you cannot feel. So I'll just give you actually a very concrete example. There will be the Olympic Games very soon in Europe. There will be the Olympic Games in the United States, next Olympic Games. So I think it's extremely important to preemptively teach the audience how Russia might exploit that. We already know that Russia was talking about some bed bugs and exploiting LGBTQ groups during last Olympic Games in France. So we can preemptively hold them out and to actually explain how Russia routinely leaks partial truths and how they're using that as a weapon, basically to build cognitive immunity among our audience. Second thing is we have to stop chasing every falsehood. We have to zoom out and to understand and to teach, as I mentioned, our audience that information is a weapon. But here is another thing. I'm not arguing that we should spread lies inside Russia, but we have to put Russia on the defensive in the global south. BRICS is a very interesting thing because Russia has adapted its influence operations. So it's not only more about RT and Sputnik. Something that I've been following is actually BRICS and multiple information security agreements that they signed with numerous countries. They just developed something that's called like a BRICS TV. And as Russia has been constantly talking about, let's say, British and American imperialistic moments in Africa back during the Cold War. Maybe it's past time also to talk about Russian imperialistic moments with Wagner Group and exploiting Africa. And after all, for people who love history, we should also not forget that Russia was trying to be also an imperialistic power in Africa and to try to exploit them. The only problem is that Russia was a poor imperialistic power and a weak one. Second thing is, think about this. What did Russia do with Iran just a few days ago or with Venezuela? Nothing. Nobody likes a loser, and it's really past time to spread the truth about Russian weakness, that with friends like Putin, Russian allies do not need enemies. What did Russia do with Armenia, Azerbaijan? Did Russia help Armenia? No, it didn't. And finally, one of the really interesting things that I've been tracking is how Russia has been portraying the whole concept of the West being woke and Russia is a pillar of traditional moral and spiritual values. Unfortunately, that's a powerful tool that Russia has used to polarize the society. I don't want to sound political, but I will tell you that Russia is far from being traditional, moral, and spiritual, because we already saw how the Russian Orthodox Church blessed nuclear weapons. It's corruption. We already saw that there are reports how they are deeply cooperating with the Russian intelligence apparatus. We already saw that Putin has multiple kids. So I don't see, where is that morality that Putin loves to talk about. And I can go on and on about that Russia is not a pillar of traditional moral and spiritual values. But the most important thing is also that we have to understand to protect our society from Russian influence operations, because the Russian military claims that who has information superiority is going to win this war. The best defense is offense. And maybe it's really past time to employ and to apply that powerful tool. But now, probably we are doing that. Yeah, we might be doing that, but if we were doing a better job, we would not have this conversation. And my concern is that Russia as autocracy, they do not need to worry about ethics. We have to. And risk aversion is rewarded in the West. That's not something that is very problematic in the Russian society. And finally, when people ask me, are we winning or are we losing the information war? I tell them that we have to really reframe this. It's not about winning and losing. It is all about considering this as a long protracted war when you can have information superiority on a day one, but not on a day two. And that's okay. We have to be patient. And the third pillar is, in my view, sometimes, people in the West are very self-critical, which is a good thing. But we also have to remember that we have better technology, better knowledge, and better methods than Russia. We should stop putting Putin on a pedestal, because that's exactly how we want another silent war back during the Cold War. So maybe it's past time to do it again.
Ivana, I think that's really interesting. I mean, you gave us a full exposition of reflexive control. Effectively, they understand us so well that they're able to trigger our reactions and distract us, particularly our national security teams, from the real issues that are happening. And you advocate for us going further, not getting distracted, educating our people, being less concerned with risk aversion and being prepared to take the risks in order to put the impetus back on them, to retake the initiative, if you will. Do you think that we understand the Russian model well enough that we could do it? And we talk about reflexive control because I think here are some big lessons for the military listeners, is that whilst they use this in the information space a lot, you've talked about that, they've also been using it in Ukraine in the military space too. And they know us well enough that they know that we will trigger attacks on artillery positions or tank positions or command and control structures. And therefore they build these things to look like it as part of deception, but as part of, their willingness to sacrifice. Do you think that we understand the Russian machine enough to use reflexive control against them? And are they well enough educated, understanding of this, that they're sort of immune to our attempts to play their own cards back at them?
So I'm just an academic, and I'm confident to say that if I understand how Russian reflexive control operates, or at least to have some humility and to try to understand, I'm confident to say that there are a lot of people in the UK or in the US or elsewhere in the West who understand very well how this concept operates. As a matter of fact, in the US, we have also an office called Perception Management, and Russia fears this office more than anything else. But to go back, for all your listeners who are in the military, please, please, please start translating all those reflexive control documents in English. There are a lot of things that are already declassified coming from the Russian side. And the most beautiful thing about studying and thinking how Russia thinks in this space, it's because they cannot shut up and they cannot control their emotions. So I cannot tell you, Peter, what I'm able to see just in random Russian military journals that are linked to Russia's Ministry of Defense. They openly talk about that, openly. And they openly talk even how to use reflexive control when it comes to decision-making processes on nuclear weapons, which raises another question on how Russia understands nuclear weapons as a cognitive weapon. But to go back, yes, I am sure that there are a lot of people who do understand how reflexive control works. I have no doubt that Russia might think, that we might retaliate, but Russia also understands that there are the limits what we can and what we cannot do, because the whole point is that we are very impatient, and politicians, they love to score points, which means that every time when there is some falsehood, they jump into those things, totally chaotic, issuing public statements, about, no, chill, wait, no responses for days. Let them think, confuse them, pollute the information space. As someone who grew up in that part of the world, I always like to say, we think in a very emotional way, sometimes truly unwilling and unable to control our thinking. And that's our vulnerability. And that's why the West absolutely has to be calm, cool, and collected when they're responding to Russia's reflexive control. We also really need to build alliance when it comes to reflexive control. We have to understand that it's not only about NATO, because we have countries such as Hungary or Slovakia that might not be in a full alignment when it comes to targeting Russia's command and control in the information environment. But we have to maybe build a coalition of the willing states, willing and able to confront this issue.
Ivana, listen, we're out of time. I already have got another episode lined up with you where I want to talk to you about the great game, but I'm going to come back and we'll do that sometime later this year. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge. Absolutely fascinating. Much more to read about in terms of reflexive control, and a really important topic too. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 18 NATO nations, and is the world leader in command and control software.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do hit the like or subscribe buttons. The episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Waiver Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.